I was living and working in Hong Kong, and one day I found a lump on this side of my neck. And when I went to the doctor and they did a biopsy, they discovered that it was lymphoma, which is a form of lymphatic cancer. Over a period of 4 years, I developed so much fear of this cancer. I started to live my life just trying to get rid of this cancer that was in my body. But I kept getting worse and weaker and weaker. And at that point, the doctors said that it's too late, even for anything. Your body is already too far gone. You're already dying. You only have about 3 months to live. I kept wishing that this was a bad dream. My body was not absorbing any nutrition. I weighed 85 pounds. I looked like a skeleton. My lungs were filled with fluid. The tumors now in my body were all over my lymphatic system. They were the size of golf balls. And by February the 1st, 2006, I went into a coma. So it was at that point that the doctors told my family that these were my final hours and that my organs were now shutting down and I was going through the dying process. But what everybody around me didn't know was that I had left my body and I felt amazing. I could see and feel and hear everything that was happening all around me. But I felt light and free, and all the pain was gone and all the fear was gone. Something that I call unconditional love, I'd never felt anything like that in my physical life before. And I was aware of my body lying there in that hospital bed. And I wanted my family to know that I'm fine. In fact, I'm better than fine. I feel fantastic. But there was no way for me to communicate with them. I was able to see and hear everything the doctors were doing. It was very different from having physical eyes. It was more like I had 360-degree peripheral vision. I could be aware of things that were happening behind, on the sides, above, below, everywhere, and beyond the walls. And my husband was talking to the doctor outside, about 40 feet away, outside the room that I was in, and I was able to see and hear everything. I could even see and be aware that my brother, I was able to see that he was rushing to get on a plane to come and reach me because he wanted to get to me before I died.
Like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I knew science is the pathway to truth. My work in science, and especially as I pursued a career in neurosurgery, left me wondering how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. So I taught for about 15 years at Harvard Medical School. That was all setting the stage for my near-death experience. So it's important to point out we never, ever understood why this happened. When I first got to the emergency room, the doctors were very alarmed because of how quickly I'd gone downhill. Over 3.5 hours, I was deep in coma, grand mal seizures, and they found out the next day from microbiology that it was gram-negative bacterial meningitis caused by E. coli. And then, of course, they put me on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics on a ventilator, and I went through that week not really showing any signs of improvement. So by the end of the week, the doctors held a family meeting on day 7 of coma. It was a Sunday morning when they said it was, I was gone from a 10% chance of survival down to 2% chance. But unfortunately, they thought if I was in that 2% survivor category, that would never translate into any meaningful recovery. So that's why they suggested stopping the antibiotics and just letting nature take its course. Let the infection run, let me go. So way too deep in coma to have had any experience, especially when you realize that the CT and MRI show extensive damage. And yet the exact opposite is what I experienced. So how that journey unfolded was beginning in that earthworm eye view, I was rescued by a slowly spinning white light. Initially, that portal led up into what I call the Gateway Valley. It was far more real than this world. It makes this world look like a dream. That world is far more real than this one. Was like my first awareness of the divine presence of that infinitely loving force.
To me, it felt very, very real. In fact, it felt more real than this physical reality. When we leave our physical body, we leave behind everything that's associated with our body, our biology, our voice, our race, our religion. And what crosses over is just pure essence, pure spirit, or pure love. We can call it whatever we want. And so I started to encounter the essence or the spirit of other people who were familiar to me, like my dad, who had died 10 years ago. I felt his presence around me. And even though he wasn't in his physical body, I recognized him immediately. When I was growing up, we had a very turbulent relationship because I rebelled against my culture. I come from a culture where women are considered second-class citizens, and I even ran away from an arranged marriage. So when he passed away, I had always thought that I had let him down, that I had disappointed him as a daughter. I then felt that I was surrounded by other beings, and I didn't recognize them all from this life, but I did feel that I was just unconditionally loved by them, and that they were there to protect me and help me.
I was surprised by the incredible power of love that I felt by thousands of beings around me, all the way out to what I call the core, filled to overflowing with unconditional love of that divine source. And I would cycle through those levels. I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, but I could navigate back up. And I'd been told every time I entered the core, you are not here to stay. You'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things.
A lot happened on that side, but I reached a point where I felt that I had a choice as to whether to come back into my body or to stay on the other side. No part of me wanted to come back because my body was sick and dying. I was suffering here. My family were suffering, taking care of me. But it was like I entered this state of clarity where I then understood why I had been sick. I understood how it was that so many of the thoughts and the decisions and the choices I had made in my life had led me to that point where I was lying there on that hospital bed. And I realized that I had lived this life of fear instead of a life of passion and joy and love. I had never allowed my soul, my spirit, to express itself and be all that it had come here to be, and that I was more powerful than I had ever known or believed. I received the message that now that you know the truth of who you really are, go back. If you choose to go back into your body will heal. You need to go back. It's not your time yet. I started to understand that I had a bigger purpose to fulfill, something much bigger. And it was at that point that I started to come out of the coma. It was like I had one foot on each side. I kept saying to them, Dad is here. And then the doctor said, these are the drugs just messing with her mind. She's hallucinating. But then I said to the doctor, aren't you the doctor that took the fluid out of my lungs at about 4 a.m. this morning? And that's when he said, but you were in a coma. You couldn't know that. I said to my husband, isn't he the doctor that said, I'm not even going to make it through the night? And my husband said, you couldn't possibly have heard that. He said that to me outside of the room, down the hallway, near the nurses' station. And then what started to happen is over the next few days, the tumors just continued to shrink and the doctors just could not understand it. Within 3.5 weeks, they could find no trace of the cancer anymore. And within 5 weeks, they let me go home to live my life cancer-free. And that was 14.5 years ago.
Well, let me give you a fact of science, okay? Fact. There's not one gene that causes cancer. Cancer is not caused by a gene. Cause of cancer is not living in harmony with the world that you're in. And the disharmony leads to dis-ease.
And then I came back to this world. But when I did, when I woke up in that ICU bed on day 7 of coma, all I knew was where I had been. My brain was so wrecked, and I still had no memories of my life before. I was still not even recognizing loved ones at the bedside, although that recognition in my language came back very rapidly, literally over hours. Memories were even more complete than they had been before coma.
My doctor who was treating me actually said that you're not the first person to tell me such a story, crossing over on the other side.
True open-minded skepticism is absolutely important ingredient in this quest. I will say I was my own worst skeptic. I'd spent 54 years of my life honing a very conventional scientific worldview. But essentially, my coma journey to a neurosurgeon interested in explaining consciousness had a tremendous number of lessons to help me understand that much of what we thought was completely wrong. And what I've found is in the 11 years since, I've worked with many scientists around the world who are interested in consciousness. All of the tremendous evidence that is available to all of us who study things like the afterlife, parapsychology, the reality of things like telepathy, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences. All these phenomena of consciousness, bringing science and spirituality together and explaining consciousness in a much more satisfactory fashion than the very bleak and paltry fiction of materialist explanation.
My name is Dean Radin. I'm the Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. The Institute of Noetic Sciences is an institute devoted to studying the nature of consciousness. It's part of a spectrum of experiences. So some of them are psychic, some are mystical, some are déjà vus, clairvoyance, precognition, the whole range of experiences. And it's the idea that everything that we know, including the mind, is made up out of matter and energy. From that perspective, the idea that aspects of your mind or awareness can transcend space and time, because that's the strangeness of mystical and psychic experience, these things are considered impossible. It's not possible to have parts of your awareness extending away from your brain. So because the prevailing idea is that it's impossible, the only way of understanding the experiences is that they're either made up or they're coincidence.
One of the problems with materialist science is they keep looking in the material world to try and prove things. So if you're looking at the physical brain and you're saying, well, we assume that this thing creates consciousness, and then you see all these things you can measure, like on a functional MRI or on magnetoencephalography or a spectral electroencephalogram or whatever your mode of examining the brain, if you're sitting there thinking whatever we see is going to explain it all, you're obviously misled. Sorry, it's not there.
The usual presumption is that the brain processing is the causal reason why we have consciousness. But that's an inference that would be very difficult to justify, because it could just as well be in the other direction. And in fact, this is what gives rise to ideas that it's not that the brain is generating consciousness, but rather the brain is receiving consciousness, or is a filter of consciousness which is somehow out there. This is the difference between looking at a radio and listening to it playing music and opening up the radio expecting to find little tiny people with instruments in it. Well, that's not what happens. You open the radio and you see something which ultimately is receiving information that's coming from somewhere else.
From the time I was a child, I was intrigued by the physical world and by what is the mind. So I went on and got my PhD in neuroscience. At a certain point in my career, I had an experience in meditation at a meditation retreat that shifted my whole understanding of awareness. I was a bit in a quandary because I had a sense that there was more to consciousness than I had originally thought. When you look at other research, for example, on near-death experiences, you find out somebody has had cardiac arrest, their brain has completely stopped, and yet these people nevertheless retain their consciousness, and they do something even more than that. They actually see now everything around them from a perspective outside of their body.